The phone rang at 4:11 on a Tuesday, and my brother's voice came through cracked in half. They said, "No, Beth, they bought a boat." I was 33, standing in a Columbus parking garage with my keys already in my hand. Brandon was 26, lying in a hospital bed 2 counties away with his knee crushed flat. The surgeon needed $10,000 and a yes inside 3 weeks, or the joint would fuse wrong forever. I hadn't spoken to our parents in 8 years. On the call, I could hear my mother somewhere behind him, half into the speaker, shrugging the way she always shrugged. Maybe a limp will teach him responsibility. Then the line went quiet. What I found later in Nana's old cedar box turned that quiet into something they should have feared. I didn't. 8 years of silence broke open in about 30 seconds. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my days finding the place where the money stopped matching the story people tell about it. So when Brandon's said the word boat, some cold part of my brain filed it before the rest of me could feel it. I sat down on the concrete bumper of my own car and asked him to slow down and tell me everything. Scaffolding had collapsed onto job site. His knee took the corner of a steel frame. The ER stabilized him, but the orthopedic surgeon wanted to go in and rebuild the joint with plates and screws, and Brandon's insurance left a $10,000 hole he could not climb out of in time. He had called the only people who were supposed to catch him. He had called Mom and Dad. "Beat," he said, and his voice did the thing it used to do when we were kids. And he was trying not to cry in front of me. I didn't know who else to call. 8 years I had built a whole life on the other side of that silence, and I had built it carefully, brick by brick, so nobody could ever take it from me again. I told him I would be there by morning. I did not tell him why I had left. Here is the part of the story my parents told the neighbors. Bethany got proud. Bethany got an education and decided her family wasn't good enough. Bethany abandoned us. They told it so often that I think they came to believe it. The truth was smaller and uglier. When I was 25, fresh out of my accounting program and still living in their orbit, I helped my grandmother organize her papers. Nana Ruth was sharp until the very end, but her handwriting had started to shake, and she asked me to make sense of her accounts. I found a ledger that did not close. There was money that had come in from the sale of her late husband's land, money she swore she had set aside for the kids, and there were withdrawals against it that she did not recognize. When I asked my father about it, calm as anything, just one daughter, and asking one student, he went a color I had never seen on him. He told me I was confused. He told me Nana was getting forgetful. My mother took me into the kitchen and said in that low, even voice, "Don't go digging in things that aren't yours, Bethany. It only makes trouble." I was 25. I had no standing, no copies, no proof, and a whole family telling me I was imagining a hole I had watched with my own eyes. So, I did the thing that felt like survival. I packed a bag, took a job offer in Columbus, and stopped answering the phone. For 8 years, I told myself I had simply moved on, but I never forgot the ledger that wouldn't close. And now, my brother needed $10,000, and my parents had a brand new boat. I drove the 110 miles back to Maple Lake before the sun was fully up. The hospital sat 1 county over in Carlton. Brandon looked smaller than I remembered, propped up with his leg in a long brace, an IV taped to the back of his hand. He grabbed my fingers and held on like he was 12 again. The surgeon came by on rounds while I was there, a blunt woman named Dr. Reyes, who did not waste my time. She showed me the imaging. The knee needed an open reduction and internal fixation, plates and screws to put the joint back where it belonged. Insurance would cover most of the hospital stay, but the surgeon's fee and the hardware left roughly $10,000 that Brandon owed up front. And there was a clock. "Cartilage and bone don't wait," she said. "We have a window, maybe 3 weeks before the joint starts setting wrong. After that, we're talking about a permanent limp, chronic pain, possibly a fusion down the line. $10,000, 3 weeks, a working man's knee." I asked Brandon gently what Dad had said when he called him. Brandon looked at the ceiling for a second before he answered. "He said they couldn't help right now." A pause. "He said they just bought a new boat." I kept my voice level. I told my brother not to worry about the money. I told him I would handle it. Then I went to see our parents. The house I grew up in sits on a slope above the water, and the first thing I saw when I pulled in was the boat. It was enormous, white and chrome and obscene against the gray morning, tied at a dock that had a fresh coat of stain. The name was already painted across the stern in gold script. Second Wind. My father came out onto the porch before I reached the steps, and for a moment we just looked at each other across 8 years. He had gone soft and prosperous. My mother appeared behind him, drying her hands on a towel, and her face did not change at all when she saw me, which told me everything about how much she had missed me. "Well," she said, "look who remembered the way back." I did not come to fight. I came to confirm what I already suspected, so I said it plainly. Brandon needs $10,000 for surgery, and he needs it in 3 weeks, or he loses the leg the way it works now. "Will you help him?" My father spread his hands and started talking about cash flow, about how everything was tied up, about how you can't just pull 10,000 out of the air. Behind him, that boat creaked against its lines. My mother folded her towel into a perfect square. "He should have been more careful on that job," she said. "Brandon's always been careless. Maybe a limp will teach him responsibility." There it was again. I got back in my car, drove to a diner on Route 9, and ordered coffee I did not drink. Then I called the hospital's billing office and asked what it would take to guarantee Brandon's surgery. I had the money. That is not a brag. I gave the billing office my information and told them to schedule the procedure the moment Dr. Reyes had an opening. Just like that, the clock stopped being a death sentence. My brother would walk, but sitting in that vinyl booth with my cold coffee, I could not let go of one thing. My grandmother's voice from a kitchen a decade gone. She used to pat my hand and say, "Don't you worry about you and your brother. I've got it set aside." I made sure. What exactly had Nana set aside, and where had it gone? Stay with me. He told me what the last 8 years had really been like. How Mom and Dad were always tight on money whenever he needed something. There was the RV they took to Florida every winter. There was the kitchen they redid in granite. They told everybody at church they gave us everything, he said, picking at the seam of the couch. Dorsey actually thanked them once for being so generous to their kids. I just stood there. The whole town thought Gerald and Lorraine Parrish had sacrificed everything for their children. The whole town had it exactly backwards. I asked Brandon if he remembered Nana ever talking about money she'd set aside for us. He went still. "Yeah," he said slowly. "She told me the same thing she told you, that there was something put away. I figured it just went to the funeral." I didn't say anything, but I had already decided I was going to go find it. The next morning, I did what I do for a living. Except this time, the client was a dead woman, and the company under audit was my own family. I started with public records. I pulled my grandmother's probate file. Ruth Parrish had died 9 years ago, the spring before I left. Her will was simple and mostly went to my father, her only child. But there was a line in the file that made me set my coffee down. A reference to a separate instrument recorded the same year 2 years before she passed. A trust, not a vague promise, not a savings account, a formal recorded trust with a name on it. The Ruth Parish Family Trust, established for the medical and educational needs of my grandchildren, Bethany and Brandon, funded at creation with $48,000 from the sale of my grandfather's farmland, $48,000 for our medical and educational needs, and in 9 years, not $1 of it had ever reached either of us. I needed to know who controlled it. The trust named 2 trustees, my father Gerald and a man called Roy Tasker. I found her in her driveway unloading groceries, and the moment she saw me, her face closed like a till at the end of a shift. "So, you came back for the drama?" she said. I told her I came back for Brandon. I told her about the surgery, about the $10,000, about the boat. She did not look surprised. She looked tired. Mom and Dad don't have it to give Beth. You don't know what their expenses are. I asked her very evenly whether their expenses included a $40,000 boat. Paige's jaw tightened. That's their business. Brandon needs to learn to stand on his own 2 feet. Maybe a limp will teach him responsibility. She did not even hear herself say it. I asked her one more question before I left. Did she know Nana had set up a trust for me and Brandon? Paige's hands went still on the grocery bag. For just a second, something flickered across her face. Then she said, "I don't know what you're talking about," and carried her bags inside. Paige's hands had told me more than her mouth. She knew about the trust, which meant the silence around it was not an accident. It was a household policy. I went looking for the lawyer who had drafted it. I made an appointment with old Mr. Howren himself. But when I asked to see an accounting of the fund, where the $48,000 had gone, what was left, he got cautious in a way that lawyers get when they are standing near a conflict of interest. "Bethany, I drafted the instrument," he said, "but your father and Mr. Tasker administer it. As a beneficiary, you have rights to an accounting, but I can't just hand you the trustees' records. You'd have to request them formally. Frankly, your father has been a client of this firm for years." It was a wall, but it was an honest wall. As I left, he said quietly, "Ruth would have wanted those children taken care of." I told him I knew. I intended to make sure of it. While I was building my case, my brother's knee was not waiting for the law. Dr. Reyes called me on Thursday. She had reviewed the latest films, and the joint was already showing early signs of setting. The 3-week window she'd quoted was really more like 10 days now. If we wanted the best outcome, the surgery needed to happen that week. I did not hesitate, and I did not wait for any trust to come through. I wired the full surgical deposit to the hospital that afternoon out of my own savings and told them to book the first slot Dr. Reyes had. Brandon cried when I told him it was scheduled. Not about the leg, he said about the fact that somebody had just handled it. No lecture, no conditions, no speech about responsibility. He said he had forgotten what that felt like. I drove back to my motel. One was the wound, one was the bandage, and between them sat a single question I now had the legal right to force an answer to. $48,000 established for the medical and educational needs of Bethany and Brandon. Where had every dollar gone, and who had signed it away? I was about to make my father tell me. "I hear you've been busy," she said, going through old papers, bothering Mr. Howren. I told her I was just getting my brother's affairs in order. "Don't embarrass this family, Bethany." There it was. Not "don't lie." Don't embarrass us. That money was spent on things this family needed, she said. "You have no idea the bills we carried. You weren't here." Then she caught herself and her voice hardened. "There's nothing for you to find. Leave it alone." But it was too late. I thought about the granite kitchen and the RV in Florida, and my brother's crushed knee and the $10,000 they would not give. I told my mother I would leave it alone if she could show me one piece of paper proving the trust had been spent on me or Brandon. She hung up. I took that silence as my answer. The second trustee was a man named Roy Tasker. Roy ran an insurance agency in town. He and my father had been friends for 30 years, the kind of friendship that is mostly favors. I did not have the trust accounting yet, but I would have bet my license that every withdrawal from the Ruth Parish Family Trust carried two signatures, my father's and the signature of a man who would never ever tell him no. It made me think about my grandmother, who was no fool. She had named two trustees precisely because she did not fully trust her own son with money meant for her grandchildren. She had built in a safeguard, and my father had quietly defeated it by choosing a partner who was bought and paid for before the ink was dry. The cruelty of it sat in my chest like a stone. Nana had tried to protect us from the grave, and they had picked her lock. I did not feel like crying. I felt like a person who had finally found the exact place where the money stopped matching the story. Now I just had to force it all into the daylight in a way that no rubber stamp and no folded towel could deny. The break in the case did not come from a courthouse. It came from my brother's closet. I was at Brandon's apartment, helping him sort through boxes he'd hauled out of our parents' attic years ago, the overflow nobody wanted, and he said almost offhand, "Nana's stuff is in that cedar box if you want it." I had forgotten it existed. It was a small chest, the kind people used to keep blankets in, and it smelled like her when I opened the lid. Inside were her reading glasses, a stack of birthday cards she'd never sent, and at the bottom, wrapped in a tea towel, a manila envelope. Inside the envelope was my grandmother's own copy of the trust deeds, the signed original, not the recorder's grainy scan, and clipped to it, a letter in her shaking hand. She had written it to me and Brandon, both names at the top. She wrote that she had sold Grandpa's last 40 acres so there would be money for our schooling and our doctors, because she had watched our father with $1 and she did not trust him to think of us. She wrote that she had named Roy as a second signer and prayed it was enough. And then the line I will hear in her voice until the day I die. "If anyone ever tells you there's no money for you, child, you show them this." I sat on Brandon's floor and read it out loud to him. And my steady accountant's voice finally cracked on that sentence. She had known 9 years in the grave, and my grandmother had reached out of that cedar box and handed me the exact weapon I needed. Not a recording, not a rumor, her own signed document, and her own written intent, naming me and my brother. I had the truth now. I just had to set the table. With my own lawyer's help, I finally pried loose the trust's bank records. And then I did the thing I am genuinely good at. I sat down at the motel desk with the trust deed on my left and 9 years of account statements on my right, and I reconciled them line by line. It is tedious work. It is also the kind of work that does not lie. The $48,000 had come into the trust account the year Nana created it, exactly as the deed said, and then starting about a year after she died, it began to leave. Not all at once. That is how people who are stealing convince themselves they are only borrowing. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. Each withdrawal carrying 2 signatures, just like I'd predicted, my father's and Roy Tasker. I matched the dates against what I could reconstruct of my parents' purchases. A $9,000 withdrawal the same month they redid the kitchen. $12,000 the spring before the RV appeared in their driveway. And then the one that made my jaw set, the largest single withdrawal of all, drained from the account just 11 weeks before a gleaming boat named Second Wind showed up at their dock. The trust was nearly empty. There was a little under $4,000 left of my grandmother's 48. The leftovers of a fund that was supposed to put us through school and catch us when we were hurt. They had not spent it on us. They had spent it on the exact luxuries Brandon had listed from that couch. The hole in the ledger I'd seen at 25 had a bottom now, and I was standing on it. Everything I needed was on that desk. Now I had to decide where and in front of whom to lay it down. I drove out to the public boat launch that evening just to look at it. Second Wind sat at my parents' dock down the shoreline, lit up gold in the last of the sun, rocking easy on the water like it had never cost anybody anything. We just bought a new boat. My father had said it to my injured brother as a reason, as an excuse, as though a boat were a fixed expense, a medical necessity, a thing that simply could not be helped. I stood on that launch and let myself feel it all the way through, the full weight of what they had done, and then I sat it down and got to work. Because anger is a terrible auditor, I went back to the motel and I built my file the way I'd build it for a courtroom. Even though I wasn't planning on a courtroom, not first. I made a timeline clean and simple that any person could follow. The trust created, the money for the grandchildren, the withdrawals, the matching purchases, the boat. I made it so clear that no folded towel and no low even voice could fog it up because I had decided how this was going to end. Not in a lawyer's office where they could lie quietly and settle quieter. My parents had spent my grandmother's gift performing for an audience. The whole town that thought they were generous and put upon and good. So the audience was exactly where I would give it all back to them. The lawyer I hired was a woman named Margaret Sutton, and she practiced 2 towns over in Carlton, far enough from Maple Lake that she had never shaken my father's hand. She was in her 50s, plain-spoken, and she read my reconciliation with the slow appreciation of someone who knew exactly how rare it was to have a beneficiary walk in with the math already done. Most people come to me with a feeling, she said. You came to me with a spreadsheet. She laid it out for me in clean legal terms. What my father and Roy Tasker had done was a textbook breach of fiduciary duty. As trustees, they were legally bound to spend that money only for me and Brandon, diverting it to a kitchen, an RV, a boat. That was not a gray area. That was self-dealing, and the law took it seriously. I had standing as a named beneficiary to demand a full accounting, to sue for restitution of every diverted dollar, and to ask a court to remove them as trustees. Margaret could file the moment I gave the word. And given the documentation, she expected a court to order repayment and very possibly to put a lien on assets bought with trust money to secure it. A lien on assets. I asked her just to be sure I understood whether that could include a boat. She almost smiled. If trust funds can be traced to its purchase, absolutely. So, I had it, not a gift that fell into my lap at the last second. I had built this public records, a cedar box, 9 years of statements, a reconciliation done by my own hand. The weapon was real and it was mine. Now for the timing. Before I set the table, I gave my sister one chance to get up from it. I drove to Paige's house, and I showed her a single page, 1 bank statement, 1 withdrawal, 2 signatures. Dated the month our parents redid their kitchen. I didn't say anything. I just let her look. Paige sat down at her own kitchen table like her legs had quit, and for a long moment, she didn't speak. When she did, her voice had none of the family liturgy in it. I knew there was money, she said. I didn't know it was that much. I didn't know it was yours and Brandon's by name. And then she told me something I hadn't expected, and it cracked her open right in front of me. 2 years ago, drowning after her husband lost work. She had gone to our parents for help, and they had given her $3,000. Out of the trust, she realized now, though they never told her where it came from. They made me feel like I owed them my life for it, she whispered, and it wasn't even theirs to give. It was yours. For 1 second, I saw my sister clearly. Not a villain, just a woman who had stayed and been bled and been made grateful for her own stolen blood. I felt for her. I did. But feeling for someone is not the same as trusting them. Because when I asked Paige if she would stand with me, if she would tell the truth when it counted, she looked at her kids' drawings on the fridge and she said, "I can't, Beth. They're my kids' grandparents. I have to live here." She chose silence. I understood it. I even forgave it. But I crossed her off the list of people I could count on, and I drove back to the motel alone. Brandon's surgery happened on a Wednesday, and it went well. Dr. Reyes came out and told me she'd gotten the joint back where it belonged, that with the plates and screws and a year of hard rehab, he'd walk without a limp. I sat in that waiting room and felt the first clean thing I'd felt in weeks. My brother's leg was saved. Whatever else happened, that was already true and could not be taken back. But my parents had learned I wasn't going quietly. My father called me that same evening, and the soft, prosperous man from the porch was gone. "I don't know what you think you found," he said, "but you go spreading lies about this family, and I will sue you for slander. You hear me? I'll take you for everything." It was a bluff and a clumsy one. You cannot sue someone for slander when the thing they are saying is true and documented. But it told me he was scared, and scared men make noise. He started working the phones around town, getting ahead of the story, telling anyone who'd listened that his bitter daughter had come back to tear the family apart over nothing. He even called Brandon's hospital room looking for sympathy. And my brother, bless him, fresh out of anesthesia, told him to lose the number. So now there were 2 stories loose in Maple Lake. My father's, in which I was the jealous one, come to wreck a good family, and mine, sitting in a folder, in which a grandmother's gift to 2 grandchildren had been quietly devoured. The town would get to choose which one to believe, and I knew exactly the moment I would force the choice, a moment my parents had been planning for weeks. An event built entirely around showing the whole lake how blessed and generous the parish family was. My parents were throwing a party, a christening they called it, for the boat. They had invited half of Maple Lake, neighbors, church friends, my father's old business contacts, the pastor who'd baptized me. There would be a dock decked in bunting, champagne in plastic flutes, a little ceremony where my father would break a bottle on the bow of second wind and make a speech about hard work and good fortune. It was, when you thought about it, the single most arrogant thing they could have done. They were going to stand in front of the entire community and celebrate the boat they had bought with my grandmother's stolen gift. The boat they had named as their excuse for letting my brother's knee rot. And every person at that party thought they were good people. That was the arena, not a courtroom where my father could hide behind a quiet settlement and a sealed file. The dock, in front of everyone whose good opinion my parents had spent that money to buy. I called Margaret Sutton and told her my plan. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Legally, file the petition Monday regardless. But what you do at that party, that's not my department. Just don't say a single word you can't put on paper." I told her every word I planned to say was already on paper. I had copies made. The trust deed, Nana's letter, the reconciliation, the bank statements with 2 signatures, a clean folder for the family to see, and the original cedar box letter that I would read out loud in my grandmother's own words. I was not going to scream. I was not going to call them names. I was going to stand up at their party very calmly and let my grandmother finally have the last word. The christening was Saturday. I marked it on the calendar like a surgery date. In the days before the party, I did the unglamorous work that real justice actually runs on. Margaret drafted a formal demand letter and a petition for an accounting and restitution ready to file with the probate court first thing Monday. I assembled the family version of the evidence. Not legal jargon, but the plain human timeline I'd built, the one anybody standing on a dock with a champagne flute could follow in 30 seconds. Trust created by Ruth Parrish. $48,000 for the medical and educational needs of Bethany and Brandon. Withdrawn signature by signature into a kitchen and an RV and a boat. I practiced saying it out loud in my motel room until I could do it without my voice climbing. That was the discipline that mattered most. I knew my parents. The second I raised my voice, they would have their out. There's Bethany. Hysterical. Dramatic. Just like we told you. So, I rehearsed calm the way other people rehearse a toast. I want to be honest with you about something. Part of me wanted to do it cruelly. Part of me wanted to wait until my father was mid-speech basking and cut his legs out in front of the whole town. But my grandmother hadn't written that letter out of spite. She'd written it out of love to make sure her grandchildren were cared for. So I decided I would let her letter do the cutting, and I would just hold the paper. I packed the folder. I packed the cedar box envelope, the real one, in a separate sleeve so it wouldn't get mixed in. I laid out clothes that said respectable, not vengeful. A plain blouse, my hair down. When you are about to tell the truth in front of 100 people, you do not want to look like the villain they were warned about. You want to look like exactly what you are. Their daughter with the receipts. My mother came to my motel the night before the party. I don't know how she found out where I was staying, but Maple Lake keeps no secrets. And there she was at my door at 9 in the evening, smaller than I remembered, her hands working at the strap of her purse. For a moment, I thought she'd come to confess. I should have known better. She came to manage me. She started soft. Bethany, sweetheart, whatever you think you found, this isn't who we are. We're your family. When soft didn't move me, she shifted the way she always had into grievance. After everything we did for you, we fed you. We raised you. We kept a roof over your head. And this is the thanks. And then when grievance didn't move me either, she reached for the old stone in her pocket. Except this time she aimed it at me. Your brother brought that knee on himself. And you? You've always thought you were better than this family. Maybe a little humility would teach you some responsibility. There it was. The daisy cutter turned on me at last, and I just looked at her. I did not take the bait. I asked her one quiet question. Mom, did you spend Nana's trust on yourselves? Her face did something complicated. For 1/2 second, I think she considered telling me the truth. Then her chin came up. That money was ours to manage, she said. You don't understand the first thing about it. Ours to manage, not ours to keep. Not we never touched it. Even now, cornered, she could only justify, never deny. I told her I'd see her at the party. She left without another word, and I watched her taillights go down Route 9, and I felt no triumph at all. Just a tired kind of certainty. Tomorrow, the town would understand it perfectly. Roy Tasker found me the morning of the party. He was waiting by my car in the motel lot, sweating in a golf shirt, his eyes doing the nervous calculation of a man who has just realized which way the wind is about to blow. Bethany, let's be reasonable. He had heard somehow that I had the accounting. He offered me a deal right there on the asphalt. He'd personally see to it that the trust got made whole, his words, quietly, out of his own pocket if he had to, if I would just call off whatever I was planning and keep his name out of it. "I've got a business, a reputation," he said. "Your dad talked me into co-signing those withdrawals. I never saw a dime of it. I was doing him a favor." And there it was, the second confession in 2 days, handed to me for free. He had just admitted out loud in a parking lot that my father directed every withdrawal and that he, Roy, had signed off on money he knew wasn't his to move. I did not take his deal because a quiet fix was exactly the thing my parents wanted. The money slipped back into the account, the boat kept, the story buried. The whole town's still believing the Parishes were good and their younger daughter was bitter. That was not justice. That was a coat of paint. I told Roy the trust would be made whole through the court in the open, and that he was welcome to bring his own lawyer. He called me a name I won't repeat as I got in my car. I didn't mind. A man only gets that ugly when he's already lost. I drove to my grandmother's old church to sit for 10 minutes before the party. And I asked her in my head to help me keep my voice low. I stopped to see Brandon before I went to the dock. He was home from the hospital by then, leg propped on a stack of pillows, a walker parked by the couch. He knew what I was about to do. I'd told him everything. The trust, the cedar box, the numbers, the plan. He was quiet for a while, and then he asked me the question I'd been asking myself. "Is it worth it, Beth? They're still our parents. You could just let it go. The leg's fixed." We won. I sat down on the edge of the couch, and I tried to give him an honest answer because he deserved one. I told him this was not about getting even. If it were only about getting even, I'd have done it cruel. Mid-speech for the whole town. This was about getting back. Nana left that money for him and for me on purpose with her name on it, and somebody had to make it mean something or her last act of love would just dissolve into a boat. "I'm not doing this to hurt them," I said. "I'm doing this because she trusted me to. If I stay quiet now, I'm just the second signature. I'm just Roy." Brandon looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached over and squeezed my hand the same way he had on the phone 2 weeks ago when this whole thing started. "Then go read her letter," he said. "Read it loud." I stood up. I picked up the folder and the cedar box envelope. Outside, the late afternoon was gold over the water, the same gold as that name painted on the stern. I could already hear the party down the shoreline, the laughter, the music, my father's voice carrying over all of it. I drove the half-mile to the dock with my grandmother's letter on the seat beside me, and I kept my voice low the whole way there, practicing. The dock was beautiful. I'll give them that. Bunting in red and white, a long table of food, champagne sweating in plastic flutes. 40 or 50 people in their summer best. Second wind rode high at the end of it all, gleaming. A bottle of cheap champagne hung from the bow on a ribbon for the breaking. I saw the pastor. I saw Mrs. Dorsey, who'd once thanked my parents for their generosity. I saw neighbors I'd known since I was a girl. And I saw my mother in a new blue dress, and my father holding court by the stern, a man at the absolute peak of the life he had bought. My arrival caused a small ripple. People had heard I was back. Conversations dipped and recovered. My father spotted me, and his smile went tight, but he was not going to make a scene at his own triumph, so he just nodded coldly and turned back to his guests. "Let her watch," his shoulders said. "Let her see what we have." I took a flute of champagne. I had no intention of drinking, and I stood at the edge of the gathering, and I waited. I was very calm. I want you to understand that the calm was not numbness. I felt every bit of it. The cedar box, my brother's brace, the $10,000, 8 years of silence, my grandmother's shaking hand. But I had decided weeks ago that I would carry all of it quietly because the loudest thing on that dock was going to be the truth. And I did not want to have to compete with it. My father tapped a fork against his glass. The crowd hushed and turned toward him. He began to speak about family and sacrifice and the rewards of a life lived right. I set my untouched champagne down on the table. I took the folder out from under my arm and I started toward the front. And I'll tell you, my father was saying, warming to it, one hand on the gunwale of his boat. Nobody handed us a thing. Everything you see here, Lorraine and I built with our own 2 hands. We raised our kids to understand that. You work, you sacrifice, and the good Lord provides. A murmur of approval. Someone raised a flute. He smiled out at all of them, his audience, the whole town that believed him. So before we christen her, he said, patting the hull, I want to thank every one of you for being the kind of community that... Excuse me. I did not shout it. I said it the way you'd say it, reaching past someone for the salt, and that was exactly why it cut through. Heads turned. My father's smile froze. I stepped into the open space at the front of the dock, beside the bow of second wind, and I turned not to him but to the guests. I'm Bethany. I said, Gerald and Lorraine's younger daughter. Most of you knew my grandmother, Ruth Parrish. A few warm nods at her name. I won't take long. I just have one thing to share and then I'll let you get back to the party. My father's voice came out low and dangerous. Bethany, this is not the time. It'll only take a minute, Dad. I kept my tone mild, almost gentle, and I saw the exact moment the crowd registered the difference between his rising heat and my quiet, saw them lean, just slightly toward the calm one. My mother had gone white by the food table. Paige stood near the back with her hand over her mouth. I opened the folder. I did not pull out the spreadsheet first. I pulled out the soft, worn envelope from the cedar box, and I held it up just enough for the front rows to see the handwriting. This is a letter my grandmother wrote, I said. I'd like to read you part of it. I unfolded my grandmother's letter, and I read it in the plainest voice I had. I read the part where she explained she had sold Grandpa's last 40 acres. I read the part where she set the money aside, $48,000 for the medical and educational needs of her grandchildren, Bethany and Brandon, by name. And then I read the line, if anyone ever tells you there's no money for you, child, you show them this. The dock had gone completely silent. Even the water seemed to hold still. I folded the letter and slipped it back in its sleeve, and only then did I open the folder and lay the rest on the food table in plain sight, 1 page at a time, like a dealer laying down cards. My grandmother left a trust, I said. $48,000. My father and Mr. Tasker were the trustees. I set down the deed. Here's the account it went into. I set down the first statement, and here is where it went. I laid them in a row. $9,000 the month this house got its new kitchen. $12,000 the spring before the RV, and the largest withdrawal of all. I set down the last page and finally turned to look at my father, and I let the silence do 1 full beat before I finished very quietly. 11 weeks before this boat arrived at that dock. Nobody moved. Mrs. Dorsey was staring at the statements. The pastor had set his flute down. 3 weeks ago, my brother asked these 2 people for $10,000 to save his leg. And they told him no. They told him they'd just bought a new boat. They told him a limp would teach him responsibility. I looked around at the faces of the people my parents had spent that money to impress. I just thought, I said, that the people being asked to celebrate this boat should know whose it really was. It was Brandon's. It was mine. It was my grandmother's love, and they spent it on a party. That was when my father came apart. How dare you? He roared. and the sound of it bounced off the water and came back twice as ugly. He came toward me, his face purple, jabbing a finger. "You ungrateful, jealous. You come to my party, you stand on my dock, and you spread your filthy lies in front of my friends. After everything. After we gave you everything." My mother found her voice, and it climbed into a shriek. "She's lying. She's always been like this. All of you know how she is. Bitter. Always bitter." They were both shouting now. Over each other, at me, at the crowd. My father red and swelling. My mother's careful composure shattered into something raw and clawing. And here's the thing I had counted on. The whole reason I'd rehearsed calm in a motel room for 3 nights. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout back. I just stood there beside my grandmother's letter, my hands quiet at my sides, and I let them be exactly as loud and ugly as they wanted to be. Because the crowd was watching, and the crowd could see, plain as the documents on the table, the difference between a young woman reading her grandmother's words in a level voice and 2 people screaming that she was a liar, while the bank statement sat there saying otherwise. My father grabbed for the folder. I let him take a page. It was a copy. I had 3 more sets and watched him crush it in his fist, which only made it worse because now he looked like a man destroying evidence in front of his pastor. Roy Tasker was already gone. I saw him slipping up the lawn toward the cars, abandoning his old friend the second the ship started down. One by one, the guests were stepping back from my parents, turning their shoulders, the warmth draining out of their faces. The performance was over. The audience had finally seen backstage. My father ran out of breath before I ran out of calm. That is what always happens. Rage is a sprint. The truth is a long, slow walk, and it always gets there. When he finally stood panting, the crushed page still in his fist, I stepped close enough that I didn't have to raise my voice, and I said the only thing I'd really come to say, "Nana didn't leave you a boat, Dad. She left them a chance. I let it land. A chance for Brandon to keep his leg without begging. A chance for both of us to get an education without drowning. You took her chance and you turned it into this." I gestured once at second wind, gold, and gleaming, and suddenly the most shameful object on that whole shoreline. Then I turned back to the guests, and I told them the rest in the same even tone. On Monday, my lawyer would file a petition in probate court for a full accounting and the return of every diverted dollar. The court could order the money repaid. It could put a lien on assets bought with it, including, I said, looking at no one and everyone, that boat. And my father and Roy Tasker could be removed as trustees for what they'd done. Brandon already had his surgery, I added. I paid for it myself 2 weeks ago. The same week they told him to learn to live with a limp. So this was never about saving his leg. His leg is fine. This is just about the truth getting to stand up at the party too. My mother was crying now, the performative kind and the real kind, all tangled together, reaching for the neighbors, finding only backs. My father had gone very quiet at last, the silence of a man doing math he should have done years ago. I picked up my grandmother's letter. I did not gloat. I did not need to. I had laid her love on the table in front of the whole town, and the whole town had read it. I walked back up the dock the way I'd come, past the untouched champagne, and nobody tried to stop me. Margaret filed on Monday, exactly as promised. It did not go to a dramatic trial. Cases like this rarely do once the documentation is airtight, and mine was. Faced with the trust deed, the reconciliation, and the 2 signatures on every withdrawal, my father's new lawyer advised him to settle. The court ordered restitution of the diverted funds, and because the cash was long since spent on toys, a lien went on the boat to secure the repayment. Second Wind sat at that dock for one more month with a legal cloud over it, and then it was sold, and the proceeds went where my grandmother had meant them to go all along, into a restored trust for Brandon's rehab and my someday children's schooling. Roy Tasker resigned as trustee before they could remove him, and word of what he'd signed off on traveled through every Lake family he insured. His business never recovered. My father and mother kept their house, but not their standing. The pastor was kind but distant after that. Mrs. Dorsey stopped saying how generous they were. Paige called me a week after the party crying to say she was sorry she hadn't stood with me on the dock. I told her I understood and I meant it. But I also told her the truth, that I couldn't trust a person who'd only tell the truth when it was finally safe. We talk now carefully a little. Brandon healed beautifully. By winter, he was walking without the walker. By spring, without a hint of a limp, the surgeon's good work and a young man's stubbornness paying off. He framed a copy of Nana's letter and hung it in his apartment over the couch where this whole thing started. If anyone ever tells you there's no money for you, it says, in her shaking hand. He says it makes him braver. It makes me braver too. I went back to Columbus and my careful, quiet life. I did not move home. I did not reconcile with my parents over a tearful dinner, because some doors stay closed for good reasons. My door is open to Brandon any hour of any day. It is closed to anyone who would trade my brother's leg for a boat and call it a life lesson. That is the boundary, and I keep it without apology. People ask me sometimes if I regret it, if family isn't worth more than money, but that was never the question. The money was just how the truth finally got measured. Family isn't who shares your blood, it's who wouldn't trade your leg for a boat. So that's how a grandmother's letter beat a brand new boat. The cedar box, the demand letter, the name painted in gold on the stern. If there is someone in your life who keeps the receipts hidden and the reasons handy, don't argue with the reasons. Go find your Nana's letter. The paper underneath is always quieter and always louder than anything they'll shout at you.